But these pedantic, looking for the X's, but these seemingly pedantic linguistic questions actually have huge implications, not just for how we understand the war, but for how the people in Ukraine understood the war. Now, what do I have in mind? Well, first of all, consider the issue of collaboration, the very difficult issue of collaboration. Where does our notion of collaboration come from? It comes, of course, from France. It comes from collaboration. It comes from the decision, the sovereign decision, of a sovereign government led by a constitutional legitimate head of state, enjoying constitutional continuity from the previous government and regime, to choose to cooperate, to collaborate with Germany. Right? That is the original meaning of collaboration. When we consider collaboration in that sense, just taking France as the most important example, we realize that we're dealing with something very different than we consider the problem of collaboration in much of Eastern Europe, or especially in Ukraine. Because there is no Ukrainian state, there is no Ukrainian constitutional continuity. There are no Ukrainian ministries or ministers. There is no Ukrainian head of government. There's no government that can be continuous or not. Collaboration, therefore, becomes a question of individuals, which is rather different, right? We find ourselves trying to explain the actions of individuals, rather than appealing, as French historians might do, to institutional continuities, to patterns of behavior, and so on. And explaining the behavior of individuals is very hard. It's hard to know what individuals are doing. One can spend a huge amount of attention to a single individual and still not be sure. Moreover, individuals have a certain tendency to provoke us to moralize that institutions do not. It's much easier to moralize about an individual murder than it is to moralize about a French police force, right? Just try it. It's a lot easier to moralize about your fellow man than it is to moralize about an institution, about an interior ministry, for example. And that changes the tone of the historical discussions, I think, in rather important ways. Now, before I move on to the next point, I want to make clear that this absence of sovereignty can have, in some cases, interesting positive implications. And the case of Andrei Sheptytsky, which was discussed so forcefully and eloquently by Jean-Paul Hemke, is one of these. Sheptytsky is interesting here both as a person and as a representative of a certain trend that goes well beyond Ukraine. As a person, Sheptytsky, as many of you will know, is interesting because he chose his national loyalty. He could, like some of his brothers, he might have been a Pole, right? Instead, like his brother Clementy, he chose to be a Ukrainian. He chose his national loyalty, right? Sovereignty here is very much in play. He chose the nation to which he wished to belong. As a churchman, he's part of a much larger phenomenon, which I find interesting. As a general matter, and this is true in Europe and throughout Europe, as a general matter, churches that were closely associated with the central state behaved very badly towards Jews when that state was destroyed. The Polish Catholic Church would be a good example. In general, churches that were closely associated with central authorities, which were majority churches, behaved very badly in wartime conditions. The churches that behaved well, and again, this has nothing to do, by the way, with Protestant versus Catholic. It has nothing to do with that. The churches who behaved well were ones who were already in a minority dissident position before the war. Right? So Sheptytsky is the only churchman of his rank to behave as he did. I think it's not coincidental that he came from a position which was already a minority dissident position before the war. Of course, in addition to that, he was an extraordinary individual. This is just an example of how knowing whether there is sovereignty or not can help us to understand certain larger patterns in Ukraine and elsewhere. The second thing, the second difficulty that I wanted to mention is precisely that sovereignty, although it doesn't exist before the war, it doesn't exist after the war in national terms, people might think that it could exist. And this creates the possibility for different motives of collaboration, right? In a French or a Belgian situation or a Dutch situation, your motive for collaboration might be conservative. You're hoping that what was will in some way continue and be restored, right? In the Ukrainian situation, your motive for collaboration, if you collaborate, has to be transformative. That is, you can't simply collaborate because you think the Germans are going to restore a Ukrainian state. There was no Ukrainian state. Your collaboration with the Germans has to be part of some much larger, usually revolutionary project. Right? There's no choice. You might see what the Germans are doing as being part of that revolutionary project, or you might not. But the nature of collaborating with the Germans has to be different. It has to be transformative. It makes no sense to collaborate with the Germans because in order to restore what was already there, right? That makes no sense in national terms. So transformative collaboration has to be the norm. Now, the fact that sovereignty is a variable helps us to explain certain things which happen in Western Ukraine. Because in Western Ukraine, sovereignty, as of course all of you know, is removed. Right? The Polish state exists and then it's destroyed. There is a national state, there isn't a nation state, and it's destroyed. And the destruction of the Polish nation state is one of the things which sets forth the processes of collaboration of Ukrainian nationalists. It's also one of the things which makes the whole ethnic conflict or the ethnic cleansing of Poles by Ukrainians possible. It's a long story which I told 10 years ago elsewhere, but it's impossible to imagine the rise of the OUN and the UPA without the prior destruction of the Polish state. These people were indeed Polish citizens. While there was a Polish state, they were not killing tens of thousands of people. Okay? They killed some notable individuals here and there, but they were not killing tens of thousands of people. To understand how a group of illegal terrorists who were running from one hideout to another became an organized partisan army that killed tens of thousands of people, you have to begin with the removal of the state and the rule of law. You have to understand sovereignty as something which is a variable. The next difficulty, the third difficulty, is to remember that the prior sovereignty over much of this territory, the prior sovereignty over most of Ukraine, was very real, but it was not national, right? The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was not a nation state. It was a sovereign state, but it was not a nation state. Ukrainians who lived in most of what is now Ukraine could have opinions about collaboration or about the Germans, which were not necessarily nationally informed. Indeed, in my opinion, most of the time were not nationally informed. They could have ideas about which was worse, the Soviets or the Germans, which didn't have anything to do with Ukraine in particular. I'm going to cite one example, which some of you will find familiar. But after the famine of 1933, there were a good number of Ukrainians, that is, inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine, who wanted the Germans to invade. Why? Because the famine was awful. Not because they were Ukrainian nationalists, but because they had experienced the famine and they wanted someone to stop it. That has nothing to do with nations or nationalism or national sovereignty. It does, however, explain sometimes the way people would think about foreign intervention. So there is sovereignty, but that sovereignty is not national. A very important example of this, again, is the extension of Soviet rule into Western Ukraine, what's now Western Ukraine, Polish Galicia and Volhynia, in 1939. The Soviet Union extends into half of Poland in 1939. It annexes half of Poland in 1939. It brings into its structures of collaboration very large numbers of people, including very large numbers of Ukrainians. Far more Ukrainians than Jews, right? There's this fantastic myth which animates us to this day that the Jews collaborated, and then the question becomes, how justified was everyone else in being mad, and how many Jews collaborated, and how bad should the Jews feel? This is completely beside the point. This is completely a question of German racist propaganda. The Germans come in in 1941 and say the Jews were the collaborators, and the Ukrainians say, yes, of course you're right, the Jews are the collaborators, right? Because that meant that the real collaborators weren't punished, and they got to keep working as policemen. Until we get our minds around this, until we understand that double collaboration was the norm, we cannot understand what happened. Even in the case of the UPA, many of those people were triple collaborators. They were Soviet militiamen, they were German policemen before they were Ukrainian partisans. There is no way to understand any of that without understanding the changes in sovereignty, and in particular without understanding the nature of the Soviet Union. If we think, like German racists, that the Soviet Union was somehow a Jewish state, then we can never get off on the right foot in terms of understanding how the behavior of other people proceeded. Okay. The next problem, or the next opportunity, if you like, is understanding precisely the German perspective. Now, the German perspective on Ukraine is precisely that this is not a sovereign territory. This is not a territory which can be a sovereign territory because it's not inhabited by the kinds of people who could ever be organizers of a sovereign state. You'll be familiar with Hitler's ideas that the way to govern Ukraine is to put loudspeakers in every village and then play dance music on Friday nights. Right? The villagers will be grateful, says Hitler. You'll be familiar with Hitler's idea that the way to make Ukrainians loyal is to give them beads, right? The kinds of things that colonial people enjoy. Again, I'm quoting. Right? Hitler did not regard, he regarded Ukrainians as German racists regarded Africans. Right? I mean, again, it's our own black-white racism which makes it difficult for us to see this sort of thing. Hitler regarded Ukrainians the way that he regarded Africans, that is, as racial inferiors. And of course, the other people who inhabited Ukraine were Jews who had to be eliminated because they were the people who bolstered the Soviet system and in general were the cause of all the evil of the world. Now, what Ukraine was supposed to be for Hitler was a colonial breadbasket. Professor Lauer has written an excellent book about this subject. I can't get into the intricacies of this. It's just important to understand that Ukraine for Hitler is not a political subject one way or the other, positive or negative, desired or undesired. It's not a political subject at all. It's a colonial subject. It's an economic subject. It's a source of food. Right? It's a way to make Germany self-sufficient. Autarkic. That's the way the Germans understand it. And in order to understand then what happens to Ukraine, you have to begin from what the Germans think they're going to do. What they think they're going to do is exploit some Ukrainian farmers, take a lot of food from Ukraine, starve most of the city dwellers. In removing Ukrainian food from its previous circulation through Belarus and Russia, starve tens of millions of people. And taking that food, they're going to feed themselves in Western Europe. When this is all done, they're going to resettle Ukraine with their own people, move millions of more people out. Right? So they begin with these extraordinarily ambitious schemes of economic colonization. And then in general are forced to de-escalate. Now this is a completely different pattern from occupation of sovereign states in Western Europe, which is improvised, which turns out to be economically quite useful, which is not nearly so informed by ideological fantasy. Now, the exception to the de-escalation is the fifth point that I want to make, the fifth difficulty or the fifth opportunity, and that is the category of the Holocaust. Obviously, the exception to de-escalation is the Holocaust. With the Holocaust, there's escalation. What the Germans think they're doing when they enter Ukraine in 1941 is that they're going to win a quick war, after which they'll begin a long final solution. Instead, they have a long war, and a final solution takes place within the war. What they think they're going to do is deport the Jews somewhere distant, probably Siberia. Heydrich fantasizes about the Gulag. Right? In fact, what they do is they kill Jews, as we know, where they live. Now, this is a problem. This is a problem for us. It's a problem for Ukrainian studies. It's a problem for the history of the Holocaust, because around the time the serious scholarly study of Ukraine began to be taken seriously by students of Europe, by students of the war, by students of the Holocaust, there was already an understanding of what the Holocaust was. The Holocaust had something to do with West Europeans, with their isolation, with their concentration, with concentration camps. There was already a paradigm of what the Holocaust was supposed to be, which Ukraine totally confounds. Right? So one of our problems, or one of our opportunities in studying Ukraine, is that in Ukraine we can see how the Holocaust actually begins. And of course, as we already have heard, we already know, it begins with mass shootings, it begins with open-air killings, it begins with murders which include the local population, its neighbors killing neighbors, as Sheptitsky many times put it. This is significant not just as an aesthetic matter or as a moral matter, it's also significant as a causal matter. Because that later Holocaust, the one involving death facilities in Poland in 1942, the one involving Auschwitz beginning in 1943, really 1944, that is a consequence of the earlier Holocaust, not the other way around. Just because we have heard of Auschwitz first doesn't mean that Auschwitz explains the killing fields. It's the other way around. The killing fields explain Auschwitz. The killing fields came first. So if we want to take the Holocaust seriously, we have to invert what we know. It's not the order that we learn things that matter, it's the order in which they actually happen that matter. And the Holocaust in Ukraine came first. And the way that it happened, just to give you an example, suggests a couple of important things about the history of the state and statelessness, and about the general history of the Holocaust. One of them is the first major killing episode this is something Professor Lauer has also written about, the first major killing episode in Ukraine, Kamenets-Podilsky, where something like 23,600 Jews were shot in 3 days. No episode of mass shooting like that had ever taken place before. Who were these Jews who were killed? Well, it's going to seem like a very complicated story, because it is. When Germany dismembered Czechoslovakia, it gave part of the Czechoslovak state to Hungary. Hungary demanded that Jews in these territories, Subcarpathian Ruthenia, southern Slovakia, document that they or their families had been Hungarian citizens in 1918. About 20,000 of those people could not do so. When the Germans began their invasion of the Soviet Union, Hungary expelled these 20,000 stateless refugee Jews across the border into German-occupied Soviet Ukraine, where they were the targets of the first major shooting. Now, why do I take you through the trouble of explaining that loop? Why does it matter? It matters because the history of the destruction of the state is very important to the history of the destruction of the Jews. And looking at Ukraine is one way for us to understand that. A second thing which is interesting about, and this connects very much to Professor Lauer's paper as well, a second thing which is interesting about Kamenets-Podilsky, about Ukraine as well, is that the Germans learned what Germans can do, right? There is confidence in the Einsatzgruppe will kill people. They've killed people before. They killed tens of thousands of people in Poland. There's no reason to expect that they will kill tens of thousands of people in the Soviet Union, which they do. What is not known, and perhaps what is not even expected, is that ordinary German police, right, the Ordnungspolizei, the order police, the nice men in uniforms who help you cross the street when you're in Munich, or Playmen, take a relevant example, that those people will kill without ideological preparation, without special training of any sort. They're used at Kamenets-Podilsky. And there we learn, there the Germans learn, what their own people will do. Ukraine is a place where the Germans learn what Germans can do. And that knowledge is very important for the way the Holocaust proceeds. It is also, of course, a place where Germans learn what German women will do. These things are not known until they are tried. And the knowledge, the German knowledge, and therefore also our knowledge, arise precisely in Ukraine. Now, this last point about the way that we have to take into account many states and their destruction and so on brings me to the very last thing I want to say, kind of concluding. In dealing with Ukraine, we're dealing with a place which is like a vacuum for national history. For various reasons, the temptation to practice national history in Ukraine is strong. There is an enormous amount of martyrological raw material in Ukraine for everyone, for Jews, for Ukrainians, for Poles. There is an enormous need, or felt need, for some kind of coherent national history in Ukraine itself. There is an enormous nostalgia, based in literature as well as human experience, in Poland for these lost territories. And of course, Ukraine is the very center, as we heard earlier, of the traditional homeland of the Jews themselves, of the Shtetl. Ukraine is the center of Jewish history, in fact. There are very many reasons why Ukraine would attract, would draw, would seem to require national history. And yet, we can tell that national history is not sufficient to explain anything. If we look just at the case, the very important case of Ukrainian Polish ethnic cleansing in 1943 and thereafter, you can't possibly understand them without understanding the destruction of the state. You also can't understand them without bringing other people into the picture, right? So many of the Ukrainian policemen who go into the forest and then kill Poles in 1943, in 1942 had been serving the Germans and killing Jews. That story does not make sense without 1942 and killing the Jews. It simply makes no sense. These people don't appear out of nowhere. They had been, not until December 1942, they had been killing Jews. Keeping that out of the story makes what happens in 1943 make no sense. That's not a question of apportioning blame. It's a way of noting that if you don't know the history of the Holocaust, you also don't know the history of the Poles. You can't have one without the other, right? The triangle, as Wendy Lauer says, isn't sufficient. You need something which has three dimensions. And now really the final one. National history is, of course, important insofar as national history allows nations to consider questions of responsibility. There's no question in my mind that Poles should be considering Jedwabne as a matter of national responsibility. There's no question in my mind that Ukrainians should be considering Volhynia as a question of national responsibility, and so on and so forth. But there is a difference between questions of moral responsibility and questions of historical causality, and we confuse them at our peril. We can't understand the causes of all of this unless we look at many states and many nations. But we can't take morality seriously unless we, with the groups with which we identify, pay attention to certain crucial events. But these are not the same thing. And of course, it's also very important when one takes historical responsibility that one is taking historical responsibility for things one's own work has done. Thank you very much.
Very good.